The wind had begun its long, mournful wail long before the storm arrived, threading through the cracks in the lighthouse's stone walls like a living thing. I had been awake for hours, though I could scarcely call it watching. More like listening to the ocean groan and waiting for some inevitable rupture. Out here, cut off from the mainland, the lighthouse had always felt like an island of stubborn defiance, a bastion against the vast, indifferent sea. But tonight, even the walls seemed to bend under the weight of the storm's fury. Lightning split the horizon with such suddenness that I instinctively flinched. The flash illuminated the jagged rocks that clawed at the water, showing the foam curling around them like white-hot smoke. Thunder followed, rolling across the waves and rattling the metal fittings inside the lantern room. Each crash felt personal, as though the ocean itself were punishing me for daring to stay. I checked the storm shutters once more. They had been fastened since midday, the tide rising faster than any forecast had predicted. Even with them secured, the wind found its way through every seam, every tiny gap. The lighthouse moaned with each gust, a low, resonant sound that set my teeth on edge. I pulled my coat tighter and returned to the stove, its warmth failing to reach my fingertips. The supplies had been counted earlier that week. Enough for 3 weeks under normal conditions, but the storm would stretch those limits, and I knew it. Food and fuel had been hoarded carefully, rationed almost obsessively, and still the thought of scarcity gnawed at me. I poured water into a mug, savoring the simple, heavy warmth that came from boiling it first, and took a slow sip, feeling the sting of salt and smoke against my lips. Then came the first signal. At first, I thought it was the wind, a strange groan in the rigging, a misfiring of imagination in a long night. But no, it was deliberate, a flash far out at sea one. Then another, rhythmic and impossible to ignore. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass of the lantern room and squinted against the rain. The storm was merciless, the waves towering and black, and yet, through the sheets of rain and the chaos of wind, the light blinked again that I knew every ship in the vicinity, every vessel that should have been in the channel, and none should have been out there. Not tonight, not in this storm. My heart thumped with a sudden, panicked awareness. Someone or something was signaling me. The thought was absurd. Who could possibly survive out there in a tempest like this? And yet, I felt a tug, a pull that I could not explain, as though the sea itself were calling me to its surface. I shook my head and turned back to the stove, trying to calm the sudden tightening in my chest. It was probably nothing, some trick of the storm. But the unease lingered like a shadow across the back of my mind. I moved down the spiral staircase to the main floor. The lighthouse, built centuries ago, had an intimacy that most people would find claustrophobic, but I had learned to find comfort in it. The stone walls held warmth from the stove. The shelves were stocked with tins and sacks that smelled faintly of salt and dust, and the narrow windows allowed a glimpse of the world outside, fierce and untamed. I lit the oil lamp, its flame flickering as the building rocked with the storm, and began to check the stores. Rations were critical. Flour, dried meat, salt, a handful of potatoes that had survived the trip from the mainland. Water, thankfully, was stored in barrels and could last longer than any food. Fuel was more pressing, both for the lamp and the stove. If the storm lasted more than a day, I would need to burn sparingly, rationing heat as much as sustenance. The storm, however, had no patience. It battered the walls relentlessly, the sound a ceaseless hammering, a drumbeat of isolation. I had seen storms before, of course. This lighthouse had endured decades of tempests that had taken men and ships alike. Yet this one felt different. It had a weight, a presence, that made the walls hum with an almost sentient urgency. I felt small in its shadow, yet tethered to it by the responsibility of my post. Night deepened. I moved to the observation deck, pressing my hands to the railing, feeling the wind tear at my coat and the rain sting my face. Lightning tore the sky again, revealing, for a brief, heart-stopping instant, a dark shape far offshore. At first, I thought it was a wreck, a ship torn apart by the waves. But the shape remained, shifting, moving in a way that no debris could. I blinked, heart hammering, and it vanished behind the curtain of rain. I wanted to believe it was a trick, a shadow born of fear and fatigue. But the signals continued. Flash, flash, flash. Always rhythmic, impossible to mistake for natural chaos. I took a notebook from my pocket and began to scribble a rough diagram, marking the intervals, the patterns. There was intent there, intelligence, or something that mimicked it. My hands shook, not from cold, but from the growing dread that perhaps I was not alone to be by the time I returned to the main room. My mind was a tangle of fear and curiosity. The storm would not let me sleep. I ate a small portion of salted meat and bread, forcing down each bite despite the tremor in my hands. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the relentless gray beyond, as if expecting the impossible to emerge from the waves. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was difficult to measure here. The lighthouse existed in a bubble, a small fortress of stone and flame, while the storm raged beyond like a living thing. I moved between the lantern room and the stove, between observation and rationing, caught in a rhythm dictated by survival. And then, as if the storm itself were tired of teasing, the signal changed. A new light appeared, closer now, dancing just above the water in a pattern that made my stomach tighten. I froze, heart hammering, and for a moment, the wind, the thunder, even the rain seemed to pause in anticipation. It was no longer a random flash. This was deliberate, almost playful, as if someone or something knew I was watching. I knew then that my solitude had ended. The sea, with all its endless depth and mystery, had reached through the storm to touch me. And with that touch came a promise of danger, a warning, and an inevitability that I could neither refuse nor ignore. I did not sleep that night. I could not. I could only watch, counting the flashes, listening to the wind, and waiting for what was coming. The storm had taken the mainland from me, severing the lifeline of roads and boats. Supplies would dwindle, my strength would fail, and still the lights came. A message, a summons. I did not yet understand it, but the sea, in its unyielding expanse, had begun to speak, and I, the last lighthouse keeper, would have to answer. The end. The morning after the storm broke, the world outside the lighthouse was both familiar and alien. The wind had calmed to a steady moan, and the rain had softened to a mist that clung to every surface. Yet the sea remained unruly, gray and churning, a living mass that refused to yield to any sense of normalcy. I stood at the observation deck, peering down at the jagged rocks below, the waves crashing with a relentless rhythm, and felt the full weight of my isolation. The mainland was gone to me now, at least until the tides and weather permitted a crossing. I was entirely, completely alone. That I had expected the storm to leave destruction in its wake, perhaps a toppled supply crate or some debris from passing ships. But nothing had come. Only the endless gray expanse, broken by the sharp tips of rocks, the occasional seabird daring the wind, and the persistent, unnatural flashes from far beyond the waves. I sat down at the small wooden table in the main room and spread out my notebook. The diagram I had drawn the night before, mapping the intervals of the flashes, stared back at me. They were not random. The rhythm was deliberate, almost conversational. I tapped my pen against the page, feeling an irrational hope mingled with dread. Someone or something was out there trying to communicate. The thought made my chest tighten in a mixture of fear and anticipation. Rationing was the first practical thought. I poured a small portion of oatmeal into a bowl, added the last of the powdered milk, and stirred slowly, trying to ignore the sense of being watched by the storm itself. After eating, I returned to the lantern room, where the light had remained dark during the storm. It now seemed to beckon me, a small signal to match the ones I had seen outside. I climbed the spiral staircase slowly, feeling the stone walls vibrate faintly underfoot, as if responding to my movements. The first flash came at precisely the time I had expected it, the pattern repeating with eerie precision. I pressed my forehead to the glass, squinting against the mist, and counted. 3 quick flashes, a pause, then 2 longer ones. The intervals were consistent, as if someone had measured them with a clock. I noted the sequence again, shaking slightly. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, a trick of light and water. But the logical part, the part that had survived decades at sea, knew that instinct could not be ignored. This was communication.by mid-afternoon. The air had grown heavier with the scent of salt and damp stone. I moved between the observation deck and the stove, trying to maintain some semblance of routine. Routine was vital. Without it, the mind began to fray, and I could feel the edges of my patience stretching thin. I checked the food stores again, noting each tin and sack, calculating the days each would last. I had enough to survive, but not indefinitely, and the thought of dwindling supplies gnawed at me more than any storm. The signals intensified as evening approached. Lightning was gone, replaced by a dim, cold light that made the sea appear like a vast sheet of metal, undulating and restless. The flashes were closer now, brighter, and occasionally seemed to move along the surface, almost as if tracing shapes that I could not quite discern. I leaned over the railing, heart racing, trying to catch a glimpse of what might be there, and then I saw it. A figure, or something like a figure, moved just beyond the surf, silhouetted against the foam. At first, I thought it must be debris, a piece of wreckage tossed by the waves. But it rose, unmistakably upright, and the flashes seemed to respond to it, pulsing in time with its movement. My hands went cold, and I gripped the railing tightly, forcing myself to breathe steadily. I had faced storms, shipwrecks, and isolation, yet nothing had prepared me for this. I retreated to the main room, sitting with my back to the wall, eyes fixed on the water. I tried to reason it out. Perhaps another lighthouse keeper on a distant outpost? Impossible. No one had access to these rocks. A passing vessel? No ship could have survived this storm. My mind spun, searching for answers, yet none came. The flashes continued, now more insistent, more deliberate, until they became impossible to ignore. Night fell. The lighthouse's lamp was lit, cutting a column of warm light into the storm-darkened sea. I moved slowly, deliberately, climbing to the lantern room once more, trying to maintain control over my own fear. The flashes now came in patterns I had never seen before, triangles, arcs, lines. They were almost playful, teasing, as though the sea itself had acquired a consciousness and was attempting to engage me. I recorded everything in my notebook, noting each sequence, each movement, each anomaly. By midnight, the temperature had dropped sharply. My clothes were damp, my skin chilled beneath layers, yet sleep remained impossible. The flashes had grown even closer, and I began to hear something faint, beneath the wind and the waves. At first, I dismissed it, a trick of the storm, a crack in my own perception. But the sound persisted, low and wavering, like a distant voice carried over water. I froze, straining to listen. It was impossible to understand. A pattern of sound that rose and fell, sometimes echoing like a human voice, sometimes unlike anything I had ever heard. I wondered if I had lost my mind, if the isolation had finally broken the walls of reason I had built over decades of solitary vigilance. And yet, a part of me knew it was real. Something, or someone, was out there, trying to reach me. I lit another oil lamp, pacing the room, trying to keep warm, trying to keep my mind steady. The notebook was filled with diagrams, sequences, and observations, but no conclusion presented itself. I was left with the raw awareness of the unknown, the realization that my solitary post had become the only bridge between the land and something vast, incomprehensible, and alive. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, before the signals finally slowed. The flashes became intermittent, and the sound faded to a whisper beneath the wind. I sat in the lantern room, shivering, staring at the gray, heaving ocean, and realized with a mix of terror and awe that I could not ignore what had begun. The sea had chosen me. I had survived storms, shipwrecks, and isolation, yet this was something different. This was not nature in its random cruelty. This was something deliberate, intelligent, and patient, and it had begun to speak. Sleep came finally, fitful and haunted, leaving dreams filled with flickering lights and shifting shadows. I awoke in the cold gray of dawn, the signals gone, leaving only the memory of their insistence. But I knew they would return. I knew that the sea, relentless and alive, had found a way to reach through the storm to me, and I, the last lighthouse keeper, had no choice but to listen. the end. The days after the storm passed in a peculiar rhythm, neither fast nor slow, but marked by the relentless pulse of survival. The lighthouse, my fortress, had become a prison, its stone walls both protector and tormentor. I moved through the narrow corridors with purpose, checking supplies, rationing fuel, and keeping my eyes trained on the restless sea. The flashes had paused for now, but the memory of them lingered in every shadow. In every gust of wind that rattled the shutters, food was always the first concern. I had prepared for storms, but no plan could account for weeks of total isolation with the mainland unreachable. Flour, dried meat, potatoes, salted fish, each rationed with meticulous care. I divided each portion into halves, then quarters, then into spoonfuls measured against the calendar in my notebook. The act of measuring and counting became ritual, a way to assert control over a world that had slipped out of my grasp. Even with careful management, hunger crept in. It was subtle at first, a gnawing in the stomach, then a distraction in my thoughts, a preoccupation that made the candlelight seem dimmer and the shadows longer. I forced myself to eat, to drink, to maintain strength, but the mind has a peculiar way of growing restless when it notices scarcity. Every tin I opened, every handful of potatoes I cut, became a reminder that the clock was running, and that the storm had left me entirely alone. Isolation, which I had once welcomed, now pressed against me like a physical weight. The silence was no longer soothing. It was a mirror, reflecting my thoughts back with an unforgiving clarity. I could hear every creak in the lighthouse, every draft through the shutters, every shift of the stone under the wind. At times, I thought I could feel the building itself responding to me, quivering in anticipation, as if aware of my growing anxiety. The sea, once distant and unthinking, had taken on a new presence. Its calm moments were only temporary. Soon the waves would rise again, restless and foreboding. I spent hours at the observation deck, notebook in hand, recording the wind, the tide, and any unusual movement on the surface. I had seen nothing as dramatic as the signals of the storm night, but small anomalies. A glint of light, a ripple that moved against the current, kept me vigilant. Every flicker, every shadow, became proof that I was no longer alone in my solitude. Sleep remained elusive. Even when exhaustion dragged my body toward rest, my mind remained alert, scanning the horizon for the faintest signal. I dreamed of the flashes, of the moving figure silhouetted against the waves, and woke with my heart racing. The line between reality and imagination blurred. I began to question what I had seen, only to return to the same conclusions. The signals were real, deliberate, and relentless. By the fourth day after the storm, supplies were visibly diminished. Flour sacks were lighter, tins dented and opened, water barrels partially drained. I calculated in my notebook, at this rate, even with the most extreme rationing, I had only a week before the stores would be insufficient. The thought of running out, of staring across the waves at an endless void with nothing to sustain me, made my stomach tighten and my hands shake. The signals returned on the fifth night. Unlike the first night, they were subtle at first. A faint glimmer, a pulse that barely caught the corner of my vision. I strained to see them, pressing my face against the lantern room window, counting, recording, attempting to decipher. The intervals were irregular now, almost hesitant, as if whatever was out there was testing me, measuring my attention, gauging my response. Sleep became a stranger. My nights were spent watching, my days spent rationing and maintaining the lighthouse, and my mind grew sharper in some ways, but fragile in others. I began to talk to myself, softly at first, then more deliberately, as if the sound of a human voice could stave off the creeping insanity. The echo of my own words in the stone halls became a companion, a reminder that I still existed in some form. Even as the sea whispered beyond my walls, food became an obsession. I began to catalog not only quantity but quality. The texture of the dried meat, the weight of each potato, the clarity of water in the barrels. Each meal was an event, a ceremony, a negotiation with my own survival. And yet, the gnawing hunger was not only physical. I craved certainty, a way to understand the signals, to assert control over the unseen presence that haunted the horizon. The sixth day brought a new challenge. The stove was running low on fuel. Each barrel of oil was precious, each flicker of the lamp a necessary lifeline. I calculated burn time with painstaking precision, noting the hours each lamp could remain lit, measuring warmth against need. At times, I sat in the dark corners of the lighthouse, shivering, imagining the distant mainland and the safety of a warm kitchen, a bed, a human voice that was not my own. The signals grew bolder that night. They moved closer, flickering in patterns that almost resembled letters or symbols. My notebook filled with diagrams, sequences, and notes in the margins, but the meaning eluded me. I felt both exhilarated and terrified. The sea was alive, communicating, reaching out, and yet entirely unknowable. I stared for hours, body tense, eyes burning, until the lamp was nearly spent and the room was cold enough to bite at my bones. Loneliness sharpened every sensation. The sound of rain against the windows became a symphony of whispers. The wind through the shutters became a chorus of sighs. Shadows stretched across the stone walls like living fingers, and I sometimes caught myself flinching, convinced a figure lurked just out of sight. Each creak and groan of the lighthouse felt deliberate, as if the building itself were aware of my fear. By the seventh day, the monotony of survival merged with the mystery of the sea. I began to speak to the flashes, quietly, almost in ritual. "I see you," I whispered, pressing my face to the glass. "I'm watching." The words sounded absurd in the cold air, but a strange comfort followed, a feeling that acknowledgement might matter. The flashes pulsed in response, or perhaps that was my imagination. Either way, I continued the ritual, measuring my words against the intervals of the lights, recording everything in meticulous detail. Hunger and fatigue sharpened my senses in unexpected ways. I noticed tiny movements in the waves, the subtle shifts in color, the play of light on the spray. Every anomaly became a clue, every ripple a possible message. I began to fear not the storm, not the isolation, but the unknown, the intelligence or force that seemed to study me from the horizon. By the eighth day, my supplies were critically low. I had cut rations to nearly half of their original measure, and even then, the gnawing ache in my stomach reminded me that I was vulnerable. Sleep had become impossible. Even brief dozes brought dreams of flickering lights and ghostly figures emerging from the sea. I awoke in cold sweat, notebook clutched in trembling hands, and stared across the gray waves until dawn. It was then I realized the full extent of my predicament. The sea was no longer simply a barrier, a landscape, or a hazard. It had become a presence, a force that demanded attention and exacted consequence. The flashes were not random. They were intentional. They were communication. And they were waiting for what I could not know. I resolved, as I have resolved every day in this lighthouse, to endure. Supplies would be stretched, rations measured, lamps monitored, but I would survive. Yet a new thought had begun to fester. Survival was not enough. Understanding was necessary. I could not simply endure. I had to answer. And so, with dwindling supplies, with cold gnawing at my bones and fear gnawing at my mind, I prepared myself. For the sea had begun to speak, and I had no choice but to listen. The end. The lighthouse had always been my refuge, a place of solace as much as duty. Yet, in these endless days of isolation, memories that I had long tucked away began to rise unbidden, curling through my thoughts like mist through the rocks. I sat by the small stove, shivering, nibbling at a rationed piece of bread, and let my mind drift to the years before the storm, before this relentless sea, before the flashes began to carve themselves into my vision. I remembered the first time I came to the lighthouse, decades ago. Young, eager, and brimming with ambition, I had climbed the spiraling staircase and gazed out at the endless horizon with awe rather than dread. The keepers before me had spoken of storms, of isolation, of the strange rhythms of the sea, but I had been unafraid. I had thought myself immune to loneliness, a man who could measure his life in light and tides rather than in human company. Back then, the world was different. Ships came and went. Supply runs were reliable. The mainland was a constant, reassuring presence. My predecessor, an old man named Corbin, had once told me of the strange signals he sometimes saw at sea. Flashes and glimmers that did not belong to lighthouses or ships. He had laughed it off, attributing them to tricks of the light, to storms playing with the waves. But in his eyes, I had seen something more: fear, respect, a whisper of knowledge that I had dismissed as superstition. Yet now, as the storm had isolated me, that old fear returned with alarming clarity. I could almost hear Corbin's voice echoing in the stone halls, warning me to trust my instincts, to record everything, to never dismiss what the sea seemed to offer. And indeed I had seen, I had heard, I had felt it, the deliberate pulses, the fleeting shapes, the strange cadence of whispers beneath the wind. Something ancient, patient, and intelligent was out there. And it was not waiting for me to flee. It was waiting for me to understand. I recalled stories my father had told me in my boyhood. He had been a fisherman, a man attuned to the moods of the sea, who spoke of the watchers of the deep, creatures and forces older than any man-made map. They were not always visible, he said, but their presence could be felt in the patterns of light and the restless surge of the waves. Sailors had feared them, revered them, and survived only by careful attention to signs and rituals. My father's stories had seemed like fairy tales then, a bedtime folklore of the coast. Now, in the lighthouse, they felt like instruction manuals written in a language only the attentive could understand. The memory of my first long isolation came next. Before this storm, there had been another, smaller one. A week trapped by relentless winds and surging tides. I had survived by careful planning, by counting rations, by observing the small cues the sea offered. It was during that week that I had learned the most valuable lesson. The sea listens, not in the literal sense, but in a way that matters. Movements, signals, and patterns were a language, one that required patience and respect. Ignore it and it could turn cruel. Attend to it and it could guide. I pondered these lessons now, staring across the gray horizon, noting the subtle rise and fall of the waves. The flashes had been absent for nearly a full day, yet their memory pressed against my mind like a phantom limb. Every shadow became a question, every ripple a possible answer. I began to see connections between the stories of old and what I was experiencing. Perhaps these flashes were not mere communication. Perhaps they were tests, a way of measuring my endurance, my perception, my readiness. The cold air of the lighthouse bit at my skin, forcing me to wrap my thin jacket tighter around my shoulders. I moved to the lantern room, letting my eyes sweep across the endless, silver-gray expanse. A faint glimmer caught my attention, so subtle I almost missed it, but it pulsed, twice in rapid succession, then paused. I drew in a sharp breath. The rhythm felt deliberate, intentional. I had not seen it in this part of the day before. My pulse quickened. Whatever this was, it was aware of me now, and perhaps it was learning. I remembered the stories of signal lighthouses and the coded lights used in centuries past. Flashes to warn of danger, flashes to guide, flashes to send messages across distances when no voice could be carried. Perhaps what I was seeing was a form of that ancient signaling, a language older than any I had learned in my years of service. Yet the light came from nowhere I could see. The source was hidden, moving, alive. I had no way to interpret its meaning, only the unsettling knowledge that it was watching, waiting, testing. That night, as darkness fell like a heavy curtain, I lit the lamps with deliberate care. Each flame was precious, each hour of light a bargaining chip against the cold and the unknown. I climbed to the observation deck and let the wind whip against my face, tasting salt and rain and the faint tang of something indefinable. I whispered into the storm, a private ritual I had developed to keep the fear at bay. I see you. I am here. I will watch. Whether the sea acknowledged my words or not, I could not know. But the act of speaking into the void felt necessary, a bridge between my human fragility and the vast intelligence I sensed beyond the waves. Sleep was again fitful, invaded by dreams of shapes that flickered just beyond perception. Faces formed in the water's spray, voices whispered incomprehensible messages in the wind, and light danced across the stone walls in impossible patterns. I awoke in a cold sweat, heart racing, and for a moment, I could not distinguish between dream and reality. Yet the notebook on the table, filled with careful observations and patterns, reminded me that some things were real, some things were deliberate, and some things required patience beyond ordinary endurance. In the quiet hours before dawn, I recalled the last lesson my father had given me. The sea remembers, son. It remembers every slight, every act of respect, every misstep. It will not forgive and it will not forget. But if you listen, really listen, it can guide you. That thought lingered as I watched the horizon turn from silver to a muted gray-pink, the first hint of sunrise. Perhaps that was what I was meant to do, to listen, to observe, to endure. Perhaps understanding would come only after trust had been earned, and that trust had to be patient. The storm had left devastation in its wake, but in the quiet aftermath, I began to see a different kind of map, one not of geography, but of signs, patterns, and whispers. Each wave, each glimmer, each gust of wind became a message, a test, a fragment of something larger than myself. The past had prepared me in ways I had not fully understood. Every lesson, every tale, every long night spent in solitude was a preparation for this. The sea was speaking, and I was, finally, ready to hear it as the light of dawn stretched across the horizon. I felt a strange mixture of fear and resolve. The flashes would return. They always did. And when they did, I would be watching. Not just surviving. Not just enduring. Listening. Learning. Perhaps even responding. For the first time since the storm, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. Not that rescue would come. Not that danger would recede. But that connection was possible. The lighthouse had always been a solitary post, a sentinel against chaos. But now, in the cold and the silence, it had become a conduit, a bridge between the human world and the vast, unknowable expanse beyond. And I, the last lighthouse keeper, had a role to play. The end. The night settled with a weight that seemed heavier than before. The lighthouse groaned under the wind, each stone joint a reminder that I was trapped in a world dictated by elements far larger than my own resolve. Outside, the sea thrashed in restless waves, its surface reflecting nothing but darkness and occasional silver flickers, subtle yet unervingly deliberate. I felt it before I saw it. The return of the signals, they came first as a faint pulse, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of the storm-battered sea. I leaned against the cold glass of the lantern room, eyes straining for the rhythm, tracing the movement with meticulous attention. One pulse, two pulses, a pause, then another sequence, longer, more insistent. Unlike before, these were no random glimmers. They followed a cadence, a structure that seemed purposeful, almost intelligent. My pulse quickened. I scribbled notes frantically in my notebook, diagrams sprawling across the pages in loops and angles, the ink smudged by the dampness clinging to my hands. That I realized, with an unsettling clarity, that the signals were directed at me. Not merely observed, but aware of my presence, my attention. Each flicker seemed to probe, testing the limits of my understanding, coaxing me into recognition. My training, my memory of Corbin's warnings, my father's old tales, all of it coalesced into a single realization. This was not merely light or reflection. This was communication. And then, something shifted. A figure emerged, or so it seemed, just beyond the edge of the waves. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shape, tall and humanoid, shimmering in the phosphorescent spray, then dissolving into mist. The pulse of the lights quickened as if responding to my gaze. My hands shook, not from the cold, though the wind gnawed at my bones, but from a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I was not imagining this. The sea was alive with intent. That I climbed to the observation deck, notebook clutched to my chest, and pressed my face against the railing. The waves were monstrous now, rolling with a rhythm that seemed almost conversational, curling and cresting as though forming words in a language I had yet to learn. Each pulse of light synchronized with the wave's motion, a dance of shadows and illumination. I felt as if I had stumbled into a ritual older than the lighthouse, a ceremony conducted in silence by forces beyond comprehension. I tried to respond. Tentatively, I lifted a small signal lantern, the flame sputtering against the wind, and sent a series of flashes in what I hoped was a coherent sequence. One flash, pause. Two flashes, pause. Then three. I had no idea if the pattern meant anything, or if it would be recognized. But the act of responding brought a strange thrill, a sense of fragile agency in a world otherwise dominated by the sea. Minutes passed. Then the flashes shifted. They became more complex, longer sequences, patterns that suggested deliberation, intelligence, a consciousness observing mine. I felt my mind straining to decode it, to find repetition, symmetry, something I could interpret. But the code was alien, organic in its rhythm, as if alive. My exhaustion, my hunger, my isolation. All of it faded in the face of this new, urgent puzzle. And yet, danger loomed as the night deepened. A tremor shook the lighthouse. Not violent, not destructive, but precise, insistent. I steadied myself against the stone wall and peered through the observation window. A massive wave had surged closer than any before, smashing against the cliffs with a roar that reverberated through the metal frame of the lighthouse. Water sprayed high, splattering across the glass, and I realized with a jolt that the foundations themselves might not withstand repeated assault. That I scrambled down to the lower levels, checking the fuel reserves, reinforcing the shuttered windows as best I could. The storm was returning, or perhaps it had never fully left. Outside, the flashes continued unabated, now in a pattern that seemed almost playful, teasing, as though the sea delighted in my growing anxiety. I understood, dimly, that the signals were not malicious, but they were exacting, demanding attention, and indifferent to human frailty. Hunger gnawed at me, though my mind refused to consider it. My rations were nearly depleted, each morsel savored with religious care. I realized that survival now hinged not only on my physical reserves but on my ability to understand, to adapt, to respond. The lighthouse had become a laboratory, and I its sole observer, testing the interactions between human will and the intelligence I could sense in the waves. Hours later, exhaustion caught me. I slumped against the railing in the lantern room, eyelids heavy, notebook open on my lap. The flashes danced before my closed eyes, lingering, taunting, insistent. I dreamed vividly then, the boundary between wakefulness and sleep dissolving. In my vision, the figure emerged again, more defined this time. A tall, glimmering form, its surface rippling like water, its eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, burning with an awareness that pierced through the darkness of the storm. It gestured toward me, and the flashes responded, forming a language I almost recognized but could not yet speak. That I awoke suddenly, gasping, heart racing. My lantern flickered low, nearly spent, and the wind moaned through cracks in the stone. Outside, the sea had grown chaotic, waves thrashing higher than I had ever recorded. And yet the flashes persisted, now closer, more precise, almost beckoning. I felt a pull, irrational and irresistible, to approach the edge, to meet the signal head-on. I fought the impulse. I was still human. I was still fragile. My body ached. My supplies dwindled, and the storm threatened to claim the lighthouse itself. But the signals had woven a thread into my mind, a connection that I could not sever. I scribbled furiously, documenting sequences, angles, intensities, trying to anticipate the next message. Each observation felt like a lifeline, each scribbled note a shield against the encroaching madness. The danger escalated at dawn. A massive swell struck the cliffs directly beneath the lighthouse, shaking the stone floors, loosening bricks and mortar. I clung to the stairwell railing as dust and grit rained down. I realized with horror that if the foundation failed, I would be swept away into the churning abyss below. My pulse raced and a desperate clarity emerged. I had to act, and I had to act now. That I descended to the storage level, gathering everything I could reinforce the base. Sandbags, barrels, anything heavy enough to stabilize the structure. Outside, the storm showed no mercy, the wind shredding the air with icy fingers, the waves lashing at the cliffs like furious beasts. And yet, amidst the chaos, the flashes continued, unwavering, as if observing my struggle, as if offering silent guidance. I followed their rhythm, moving in tandem with their pulses, instinctively adjusting my efforts to coincide with the brief lull in the wave's assault. By midday, the immediate danger had subsided. The lighthouse shuddered but stood. I sank to the floor, soaked, exhausted, my mind teetering between triumph and despair. And then I noticed it, a subtle change in the flashes, a new pattern emerging. This time I understood. It was not merely observation. It was instruction. The signals had begun to speak directly to me, guiding my hands, suggesting action. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I was no longer merely a keeper observing the sea. I was a participant, an interlocutor in a dialogue older than any human memory. Fear still gripped me, hunger still gnawed, but awe had overtaken both. Something beyond comprehension had chosen to reach out. And I, isolated, fragile, starving but alive, had no choice but to respond. The end. The night after the storm's temporary retreat, the lighthouse felt heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the chaos and now pressed down on me. My body ached from laboring against stone and wind, but exhaustion had taken on a new dimension, a focus that sharpened my senses rather than dulled them. The flashes continued, now more frequent, forming sequences that my mind, desperate and hungry for comprehension, began to recognize as patterns. That I spread my notebook across the observation deck, the small lamp casting shadows that danced like the waves outside. 1 pulse. Pause. 3 pulses. Pause. 2 pulses. Then a long, wavering flash. Each sequence repeated, slightly altered, almost as if testing whether I could follow. I realized, with a thrill that ran alongside a shiver of fear, that this was more than language. It was mathematics, rhythm, a precise logic embedded in the chaos of the storm. For hours I recorded, compared, and tried to respond. I devised a simple code, sending flashes of my own in sequences that mirrored theirs, experimenting with pauses, lengths, and repetitions. First, nothing changed. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, the pulses shifted in response, adapting to my patterns. I felt a strange exhilaration. The lighthouse had become a classroom, and I was both student and participant, learning a language older than memory, shaped by the tides themselves. Sleep was no longer a refuge. Dreams blurred into reality. In one, I saw the figure again, more defined this time, its surface rippling like the sea eyes or lights where eyes should be, burning with intelligence. It gestured toward the waves, and I understood. It was not merely a presence. It was a messenger. The pulses were its speech, and I was the only ear capable of understanding. I awoke gasping, the notebook clutched to my chest, convinced that ignoring this communication was no longer an option. The storm had shifted overnight, leaving the sea restless but deceptively calm. I realized, with a growing apprehension, that the danger had not receded. It had merely adapted. The lighthouse itself trembled with each wave that struck the cliffs below, testing the integrity of the foundation. Supplies were dwindling. Hunger gnawed insistently at my resolve. Yet, the flashes provided guidance in ways I had not anticipated. They indicated timing, the safest moments to repair a window, to shift a sandbag, to balance the structure against nature's brute force. I moved in concert with the signals, each act of labor punctuated by their rhythm, each decision subtly informed by the mysterious intelligence beyond the waves. I began to notice details in the signals I had missed before. Variations in brightness suggested emphasis. Pauses indicated breaks in thought. Longer flashes seemed to signify warning. It was as if the sea, or whatever intelligence commanded it, was teaching me, guiding me through a dialogue that required patience, observation, and humility. I scribbled notes feverishly, my handwriting jagged and frantic, trying to capture both the sequences and my interpretations. For the first time, survival depended not merely on endurance but on understanding. Days passed, or perhaps weeks. Time had lost its meaning. I rationed food meticulously, boiled seawater for minimal hydration, and moved cautiously through the lighthouse, always aware of the pulses outside. The signals were no longer occasional. They were constant, pervasive, filling every corner of perception. At times, I felt their attention in the room itself, as if the lighthouse had become a conduit, amplifying the presence that lurked in the waves. Shadows seemed to shift with intention. Sounds of wind and water coalesced into patterns I could almost recognize. Then, one evening, the signals changed dramatically. Pulses accelerated, brightened, and clustered into a series of long sequences I had never seen before. My heart raced. The pattern suggested urgency, danger, or perhaps a test. I tried to respond, sending sequences of my own, but this time the response was instantaneous. A massive wave rose, taller than any I had observed, cresting just beyond the cliffs. I froze, expecting destruction, yet the wave broke in precise rhythm with the pulses. The lighthouse shuddered, but I realized that the signals were orchestrating not just information but physical events, shaping the sea's behavior in ways I could not fully comprehend. Fear coiled in my chest, but fascination outweighed it. The pulses were a form of control, a language of cause and effect embedded in the natural world. I began to hypothesize. Perhaps the figure I had glimpsed, the entity behind the signals, was older than human memory, a sentinel or observer of the ocean's hidden intelligence. Its goals were inscrutable, yet they were not hostile. It was testing me, teaching me, weaving me into a complex dialogue with the environment itself. Driven by a mixture of terror and curiosity, I decided to take the ultimate step. I would attempt to communicate with more than flashes. I would respond with motion, with sound, with presence. I climbed to the highest platform, where the wind threatened to tear me from the stairs, and positioned a small metal mirror I had scavenged from storage. I angled it toward the sea, reflecting the lighthouse lantern in rapid pulses, attempting to match the sequences exactly as I had recorded them. I waited, heart pounding, for a response. The sea answered, not immediately, but with subtlety. A shimmer on the horizon, a wave crest forming a precise arc, a flash that mirrored my efforts with eerie precision. I realized that the dialogue was working, that I was no longer merely interpreting signals but actively participating in a communication that transcended human experience. Each action I took influenced the response, each response guided my next action, a feedback loop that entwined my perception with the intelligence in the waves. Exhaustion became irrelevant. Hunger became secondary. The lighthouse, the storm, the waves, all became instruments in a larger conversation. I began to sense rhythm and intention behind every movement of water, every flicker of light. It was as if the ocean itself were a living mind, and the signals were the syntax of its thought, waiting for a translator who could endure and observe with unwavering attention. Then came the first real test. A storm surge unlike any before rolled in from the horizon, black and towering, carrying wind and spray that lashed the lighthouse with violent intent. I braced myself against the stone, shielding my face from the salt spray. The pulses accelerated, becoming a torrent of light that overwhelmed the senses. I realized with a shock, this was a trial. Survival depended on my ability to follow the rhythm, to anticipate the pattern, to move in harmony with the signals. Panic rose, but I focused, allowing the sequences I had memorized to guide my actions. I climbed the exterior stairwell, moving with precision, adjusting shutters, securing ropes, and shifting weights according to the flash's cadence. Waves crashed against the cliffs, and I felt the lighthouse vibrate under the force. Yet the rhythm of the signals created a strange coherence amidst the chaos. By some impossible miracle, each pulse guided me just enough to avoid catastrophe. I was not merely surviving. I was dancing with the storm, following the intelligence embedded in the flashes, the waves, the wind. When the surge finally receded, the sea lay in restless calm, dark and glimmering under a pale moon. I stood on the observation deck, soaked, exhausted beyond measure, yet exhilarated. The pulses slowed, softened, then stabilized into a gentle rhythm that seemed almost approving. I understood now. The signals were not merely warnings or tests. They were teaching, shaping, integrating me into a dialogue with the ocean's hidden consciousness. The lighthouse was still standing. I was still alive. But I knew that this was only the beginning. The intelligence behind the signals was vast, ancient, and patient. It had taken notice of me, and it would not let me go unchallenged. I was learning its language, yes, but it had lessons yet to teach, and the ultimate challenge lay ahead, in the deep waters beyond the cliffs, in a dialogue that could demand everything I had to give. As I recorded the final sequences of the night, I realized that my role had transformed. I was no longer just a keeper of light. I was a participant in an extraordinary, terrifying conversation with forces beyond comprehension. Survival, understanding, and perhaps something deeper, a connection to the vast intelligence of the sea itself, depended on my ability to continue. And I, the last lighthouse keeper, had accepted that role. The end. The days following the storm were deceptively calm. The sea lay in restless quiet, the horizon a gray line separating sky from water. The flashes continued, steady now, forming patterns I had come to anticipate. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm, to the dialogue, to the subtle guidance they offered. Yet beneath that familiarity, a tension simmered. I sensed, with a chill that crept beneath my skin, that the true challenge was approaching. I spent hours observing the waves, noting variations in swell, reflections of moonlight, and the subtle, almost imperceptible pulses that accompanied them. My body ached, my hunger was constant, but my mind remained alert, honed by the relentless necessity to understand. I realized that the entity behind the signals was preparing me, not merely testing my endurance, but readying me for an encounter of far greater magnitude. It began at dusk. The flashes intensified, no longer distant and flickering, but bold, bright, and concentrated along a line far off the cliffs. I climbed to the observation deck, straining to see beyond the foam and shadow, and then I saw it, a shape, massive and fluid, emerging from the depths. It was unlike anything I had imagined, a shifting mass of light and shadow, its surface rippling as though the waves themselves were composed of it. The pulses quickened, matching the undulations of its form, creating a mesmerizing synchronization between sea and signal. I froze. For a moment, I questioned my senses. Could one being truly command such power, such coordination? The entity hovered just beyond the breakers, its contours luminous yet translucent, shifting between the familiar rhythm of waves and something startlingly alive. It regarded me, and I felt its awareness, probing and immense. The flashes formed a rapid sequence, almost a direct message this time, urging me to act. I understood, almost instinctively, that it wanted me to follow the rhythm, to mirror the pulses in a manner more sophisticated than I had ever attempted. I grabbed the metal mirror and lantern, sending flashes that mimicked the new sequences, adjusting timing with precision. My body moved in perfect unison with the signals, each action informed by the rhythm of the waves, each response a careful negotiation with the entity's will. The storm rose again, faster this time, its intensity magnified. Winds shredded the air, waves rose higher than ever before, and I felt the lighthouse groan beneath the assault. The pulses accelerated, becoming urgent, insistent. I realized that this was no longer mere guidance. It was a direct challenge. The entity sought to test my ability to act in harmony with forces beyond comprehension, to survive under pressure that would have crushed any unprepared mind. I descended to the lower platforms, securing ropes, reinforcing windows, and shifting sandbags in precise timing with the flashes. Each movement became a negotiation, a delicate balance between anticipation and reaction. I felt as though I were part of a grand experiment, a living participant in a dialogue that transcended human understanding. Fear clutched at me, but it was tempered by awe, an understanding that what I faced was not hostile in a conventional sense, but indifferent, immense, and absolute. Hours passed. The entity drew closer, emerging fully from the depths. Its form was colossal, stretching beyond the limits of my vision, its surface shimmering with phosphorescent light. I saw patterns in the luminescence, sequences embedded in its body that mirrored the flashes I had been decoding. It was teaching me, guiding me through a ritual older than memory, demanding precise attention and rewarding comprehension with fleeting glimpses of understanding. And then, something unimaginable happened. A tendril of luminous water surged toward the lighthouse, massive and serpentine, yet controlled, precise. I understood immediately. The entity was testing the structural limits of the lighthouse, challenging me to respond in perfect timing. Heart pounding, I shifted ropes, adjusted sandbags, and braced the shutters, following the rhythm of the flashes and the pulse of the sea. The tendril struck, but the lighthouse held, resonating with the entity's rhythm as though our understanding had momentarily synchronized. Exhaustion overtook me, but I refused to yield. I climbed to the observation deck again, arms trembling, mirror and lantern in hand. The entity's pulses became a symphony, a complex pattern of light that demanded coordination of thought, movement, and perception. I realized that survival now depended not on strength alone, but on complete attunement to this intelligence, on merging my instincts with the rhythm of the sea. Time lost all meaning. The night stretched endlessly, filled with pulses, wind, and the relentless crash of waves. I responded to the sequences with every ounce of focus I could muster, my body moving in concert with the flashes, the waves, and the massive entity beyond the cliffs. Moments of fear were eclipsed by fleeting glimpses of understanding, moments when the dialogue felt complete, when I sensed that the entity acknowledged my presence, my effort, my will. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the entity receded. The tendrils of luminous water withdrew, the storm's intensity lessened, and the pulses softened, forming a slow, steady rhythm that I recognized as approval. The lighthouse, battered but standing, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief with me. My body collapsed onto the floor of the observation deck, soaked, exhausted, but exhilarated. I had survived. In the aftermath, as I tended to the lighthouse and recorded the sequences, I understood the significance of what had occurred. The entity was not a predator. It was a guardian, a teacher, an intelligence embedded in the sea itself. The flashes were its language, the waves its syntax, and the lighthouse a conduit for communication with a human mind. I realized that I had been chosen, not by chance but by necessity, to participate in a dialogue that spanned the gulf between human understanding and the ancient consciousness of the ocean. Yet the realization was tempered by a sobering thought. This was only the beginning. The sea's intelligence was vast, patient, and demanding. My survival, my understanding, and the lighthouse itself depended on continued observation, continued response, and an unwavering commitment to the rhythm of the signals. I was no longer merely a keeper of light. I was a participant in a conversation older than humanity, a fragile bridge between mortal perception and the immense, deliberate mind of the ocean as dawn broke. Painting the sky with pale hues that reflected on the restless waves, I climbed to the observation deck one last time, surveying the sea. The pulses continued, steady and deliberate, a promise and a challenge. I felt a strange serenity, knowing that I had faced the depths, the intelligence, and the storm and survived. But I also understood that the sea would continue to teach, to test, and to demand. The last lighthouse keeper, had accepted this role not out of choice, but out of necessity. And as the sun rose over the horizon, glinting on the restless water, I realized that I was no longer alone. I had a dialogue, a connection, and a purpose that stretched far beyond the walls of stone and the human experience. The lighthouse had become more than a structure. It had become a bridge to the unimaginable, and the sea, in all its vastness and mystery, had begun to speak. The end.